Hello, welcome to Sound and Fury Book Reviews. As usual, I am Tina. Today I'm doing a book review of The Brickworks by Lucy Ian Black. This is a historical fiction from Now and Never Publishing. It's coming out October 14th, 2023. I received this e-art from the publisher in exchange for a fair review. A detailed and realistic depiction of life in the early years of the turn of the century, The Brickworks feels less like historical fiction and more like a book published at the time. When the Tay Bridge collapsed in 1879, it killed everyone on the train that was crossing, leaving the son of the driver, young Brodie Smith, traumatized and reduced to poverty as a result of his father's death. Leaving home determined to make his way in the world, Brodie finds safe haven with his kindly uncle in Edinburgh and studies engineering, intent on demonstrating that the bridge disaster was not his father's fault. In search of adventure and further opportunities, Brodie then travels to Buffalo, where he befriends Alistair, another young Scot filled with dreams and ambitions. Together, the men bring industrialization to a small rural community where they establish a brickworks, changing the lives of all those they encounter with a sense of possibility and the reality of attendant loss. Told in a beautifully crafted prose, it is Black's incomparable voice, her uncanny humor, and an astonishing ear for dialogue that renders the brickworks both remarkable and unforgettable. Okay. So the Tay Bridge disaster is a real thing. I first learned about it when I was at the liquor store. Where I live, you can only buy hard liquor at a special store called the LCBO, the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, or the LICBO, or the LC, depending where you live. So I was at the LC one time, and they had used books for sale. I don't know why. So of course, along with the rum I was buying, I was perusing the selection, and I found this thing from 1975, A Drink for the Bridge by Alana Knight. I believe I said, "Go home, Bridge, you're drunk," when I saw it, and then instantly bought it. Anyway, I read it and enjoyed it probably 3 or 4 years ago, and it was about the train crash that I had never heard of before. And yeah, so if you are interested in this disaster, this book pretty much outlines every single thing about it. It's very interesting, very sad as well. So that's a very long backstory to why I wanted to read this book. So when Brickworks was offered to me, I thought it was going to be more about the Tay Bridge disaster than it ended up being. In fact, it's a very, very minimal part of the book. This is fine, but I love trains. It's a weird thing to like, but I really like trains, and I can't wait to be old and have time to, turn our basement into one of those weird train set scenery things, where the train goes around and you have the little tiny little people up there. I thought my husband would be totally opposed to this when I kind of suggested it, and he was totally on board. Haha, train joke. Anyway, this book, The Brickworks, is not about trains, but it does feature bridges and bricks. The men in the story, Brodie and Alistair, are trying to open a small business that makes bricks. The struggles to maintain capital and the risks of running a business actually compiled on anxiety I already have being a small business owner myself. I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. The author actually nails that part perfectly, especially as these men were make or break. Basically, they didn't have anything to fall back on, so their kind of struggles were very, very real and very, very palatable. She nailed the historical detail as well. This book is extremely well researched, and that you feel like you're walking through one of those pioneer villages as you're reading it. In this regard, it's less a historical fiction than a period piece, I suppose. I'm not really sure what the distinction is now that I come to think about it, but anyway, I believe it was intended to feel like a novel written, if not in 1909, but shortly after. First of all, the style is quite distant with a lot of passive voice, which was common for books at that time period. Second, it's very clean and wholesome, in that there's no mention of sex aside from the odd risque word here or there, which is what literature for the typical reader would be like at the time. There were strict kind of moralities in publishing where you weren't allowed to publish certain things. In modern historical fiction, we often get viewpoints into those that weren't given a voice 100 years ago, LGBTQ+, certain racialized people, other minorities. But this book doesn't have that kind of reflective nature to it, which is fine. But I will say I wouldn't have minded a third POV from a woman's perspective, because while I liked Brodie and Alistair quite a bit, their stories are kind of just propelling the plot forward from a slightly different angle, kind of dut, 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 where someone else's view of the situation from a different kind of side of it would have been interesting and allowed for even more historical detail, especially about women and women's status and women's roles and women's expectations at the time. We get a little bit of that, and the part that we did get was really interesting and very fascinating, but I kind of wanted more. But then again, that's my interest, so yeah. Speaking of the characters, as I said, I liked them. Brody and Alistair were brave, good dudes who take on a bold career goal. There are 2 love story subplots that were unsurprising, but they were still satisfying. We're given less scenes with the couples interacting than the men kind of just pining over their intendeds. So if you aren't used to that from older texts, their engagement might seem sudden or out of nowhere, but it worked for me because I was used to reading that in like other more classic literature. What's interesting is that you can't help but read the book from a modern lens. The way their relationships functioned, the way the men lived like as bachelors, the way a new widow had to rely on her brother to support her family are all fascinating in the sense that the author was depicting them as they likely would have been to our knowledge. Historical fiction today is often focused on showing the stuff that people who lived in the time period didn't get to see in their literature. For example, like sex, like the existence of people of color, of gay people, things like that. But this book is interesting because it's very, very subtle about kind of what it's trying to show. And in this case, for example, there's a lot of things, but one of the major things in this book is about the widow I mentioned. This is not a main character, so I'm not spoiling anything. It's kind of like a side plot. So this widow, her husband recently died. She's got like 1 million kids. And so she can't work because no one will be able to take care of the kids, you know? And so also she didn't have the skills. She doesn't have the skills to do anything. So she has to basically live off of her brother's charity, who lives like 2 days away on horseback. And it's kind of interesting how this was shown because it's very sad. And even the main character is kind of like, oh, what would have happened if the brother wasn't willing to help? And it makes you kind of think about life today and about gender roles. And it's really interesting. I just find it fascinating. And I liked how subtle this was because it really made you kind of consider it rather than trying to like tell you it. It was very good in that way. And I liked that. What I wasn't prepared for in the novel was a tragedy that occurs near the end that was quite moving and utterly sad. That took me by surprise, and it was handled in a way that felt realistic to the time period. That kind of broke my heart. Now, there is something I want to warn you about with this book. There is a great deal of focus in the novel, especially in the start, on building and maintaining a brickworks. The title says it, but it's true. If you're not interested in this sort of industry, you may find these sections a bit tedious. I found them fascinating, but I'm also a person who wants to build model trains at my basement, so take that as you will. Overall, I very much enjoyed this interesting slice of life novel about 2 regular dudes just trying to live regular life in Ontario in the 1910s. The town was fictional. Given the location in the book, I assumed the name was a renaming of a city that still exists, though I could be wrong. Still, it was cool to see my province featured in a historical fiction because normally it's just like Toronto, you know, which is an entity in and of itself. Like if you live in Ontario and you're not in Toronto, there's Toronto and then there's everybody else, you know, like so yeah, it's either in Toronto or it's in like BC or the prairies, not boring all the rest of Ontario. So it was cool to see my province featured in a way that was not Toronto focused. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book and I thought it was really good.